So today,
Insanity.
We're going to be talking about film scores. And while film scores is typically, obviously, about films, I mean, we were just talking about Game of Thrones, which as a TV series has like one of my favorite themes.
Yes.
The music for that series,
I think is how you say his name.
I honestly, I don't know his name without looking it up.
Such a good composer.
But yeah, no, that's I remember hearing that theme and just being like, okay, like this is good. Hello and welcome to Storyweavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
and John William Worth.
And this is Storyweavers.
Yep, very much so. Because I didn't start watching the series till I think it was like season 2 or 3, like a few years into it.
I watched the premiere. I had already read all 5 books that had been out at the time, which there are still only those 5 books out now, like 12 years later.
Yep, and it's like people are finally starting to accept that he might never finish them, and it's like,
yeah, we're not.
It's a hard pill to swallow.
You and I spent enough time talking about that off camera.
yes, it's venting about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, today we're talking about film scores.
So let's start. I mean, you're definitely more of the film score connoisseur. You know, I might be
I'm a film score nerd. I'd be willing to say,
yeah. I mean, but you've always been big into film, and you're big into film scores, and you listen to film scores on their own probably a lot more than I do, and a lot more than a lot of people do probably. So I'm curious to see what you have to tell me and our listeners about film scores. You know, I'm excited to learn today.
I mean, as you mentioned, like you're a musician, so I'm not sure about learning new things, but you're right. Like I've always been into film scores just because they tell a definite story. And from a young age, I was always a storyteller. And I played the violin from 3rd grade till 10th grade. So I definitely have a background in like orchestral and classical.
Yeah. I actually played
orchestral.
Violin from 4th to 6th grade.
Nice.
Yeah.
Which first violin, second violin?
Oh God, I don't remember. There was a reason I switched to saxophone. Orchestra was the first time I ever for my entire life got a C in a class. And I was like, man, if I'm getting a C in music, I was like, this isn't fun anymore. I didn't practice enough.
That's why I left orchestra, because I played second violin because I was never good with the upper positions.
Yeah.
You know, screeching cat.
Yeah. I never had a good tone out of my violin, even after playing for 3 years.
That was why I was second violin, because it was the lower registers. And then I left in 10th grade because it just wasn't fun anymore. The teacher was treating it like it was a job. And it's like, sir, we're in high school and we're doing this because we enjoy it. We're not doing it because we want to make this a career. So that's why I left.
Yeah. I ended up falling in love with saxophone and then played that.
Which is good.
I've actually been talking about like getting some of my saxes out and getting them, you know, fixed up. All the pads need fixing. They probably need $200 each to work into them, but I miss playing it. I mean, I went to college for it. I played saxophone
for
like
some
15
good
years of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, so that's my, I played second violin. And I would say probably around like junior high or even like at like 6th grade, 7th grade, I started like especially like with Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, I would say I started becoming very conscious of the music in film and what the stories it could tell and how it told the stories, particularly with Lord of the Rings at the time, just because of the complexity.
So
like, it was the first time.
Let's start with that then. Let's start with Howard Shore and Lord of the Rings, because those are Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and then like Pirates of the Caribbean. Like those are the 3 soundtracks that I find myself still listening to on their own these days, usually to accompany reading something if I just need like music on in the background. But yeah, let's start with Howard Shore.
Okay. So I actually want to comment on something you just said, how you read while you also listen to music. That's something that I can't do. I'm very much... Yeah, because like when I'm reading or writing, it's either I could do like ambience, like I'm one of those people I like to watch the ambient videos on YouTube with the rain and stuff because we get so much rain here in Arizona. But like the problem is with the music, even classical music like Beethoven, where there are themes but they're meandering, I still start to picture things in my head. So if I'm reading something, it'll start to kind of like drift to the music or drift to the television. So I just want, like, my mom could literally have the TV on, be reading a book, and she could tell you what both were doing.
Yeah, see,
I did not get that brain power.
I usually I can put music on in the background. But the thing is, like, for me, if I'm reading, the music has to be familiar. Because if I'm reading and it's familiar, I won't focus on it as much. But if it's something I'm unfamiliar with and it's intriguing, that's when I get lost.
So, or video game music, because it's repetitious, because it's meant to be played on a loop.
I think the only video game soundtrack I ever listened to is either Doom or Slay the Spire.
Oh, for me, it was Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 9, Nobuo Uematsu, I think is how you say his name.
Yeah.
I love all of his Final Fantasy music.
I'll have to check those out. I've never listened to their scores.
Oh, so good. Especially Final Fantasy 9. That was like a watershed video game in my life.
Yeah.
But no, so Howard Shore, Lord of the Rings, he composed the scores for all 3 films as well as the 3 Hobbit films. And I think he was like a supervisory role in the Rings of Power series.
The new Rings of Power series on Amazon.
Yeah, so his handprint is all over Lord of the Rings. And the biggest thing that he had over John Williams with Harry Potter is everything was written. The whole story was told. So he could plant little seeds of ideas early on.
Right.
And that was the thing. I remember when I was younger, I first heard the music and there was just so much going on that I thought it was just like random notes being thrown everywhere. Like, and then
I feel like that's how classical music sounds to a lot of people who aren't familiar with classical music. It just sounds like random notes until you start listening to the melodies and the motifs and the harmonies. Yeah.
Yep. It wasn't until like the middle of the first movie and I actually started paying attention to it that I started realizing, like, wait, there's certain things that are repeating, just like the Harry Potter theme. But unlike Harry Potter, where it was like that one identity, right? Like there's 2 themes in that movie.
Hedwig's theme.
Hedwig's theme and then Harry's Wondrous World.
Yeah.
And then there's like that little Voldemort theme, I think, and then the like little random ones in between. With Lord of the Rings, it's like he was just cycling through the themes in different tones and different emotions. And that's when I realized, like, oh my God, this is like super intelligent and super like precise. And that's why when he won the Oscar for that movie, and then he won the Oscar for, I think, the Return of the King.
Yeah,
too.
I would imagine
it was like,
he did.
Yeah, I know. I think Two Towers he was nominated, but he didn't win.
Yeah.
But no, it's just funny because especially Howard Shore, like the music I knew him before that was for Silence of the Lambs and Seven and like these very brooding scores. And then he made Lord of the Rings and it's like
big and orchestral and luscious and dense.
Yes. And it's like, so that was definitely a watershed film score moment, like 2001, 2002, and then 2003 with Pirates of the Caribbean. But it's just funny because they're all Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, not as much, but then you get Pirates of the Caribbean, which is like way out here.
Yeah.
Another film score, and this is one slightly random.
Before we even go on, I want to stick with Howard Shore for a minute, if you don't mind. So
go ahead,
I don't know this. I honestly haven't really done much, if any, research on Howard Shore, but I would assume that he was probably he studied Wagner. Richard Wagner, the German Roman, late 20th century,
late
19th century. Yeah,
the Rings. See, I know John Williams studied him.
Yeah,
you could hear it in his like
pretty much
thunderous and loud.
Anyone who writes or studies classical music studied Wagner. But my point was Wagner. He was with his ring cycle. He really brought leitmotifs. I mean, it had been being done in operas for centuries, but he kind of made it central because it was the Rings cycle. It was 4 operas, all kind of telling a continuous story, and like Lord of the Rings, there was the ring, And so he had a ring motif that would show up whenever characters were being influenced by it or thinking about it or using it. And that is exactly what Howard Shore did in Lord of the Rings. He had a theme for the ring. And even if the ring wasn't on screen, if its power was somehow being influenced in the scene, that would come up. And it might be slower. It might not be, the front melody. It might show up as a counter melody, but he did really interesting things like that.
Oh yeah. I watched a video actually a little while back of like where J.R. Tolkien got the inspiration for certain things, and they actually referenced the ring cycle.
Yeah.
And like J.R. Tolkien said, no, I that wasn't something I was thinking of. And it's like, I can understand like probably it wasn't, but the similarities are there, like you said.
Yeah.
And at least in terms of like Howard Shore studying Wagner.
He had to have.
He had to have, because I thought immediately of one of his first film scores, which was for a film called The Fly, the remake of The Fly.
Okay, yeah, the horror film.
And if you listen to that score, it's an opera. It's big, it's bold, and it's like, it's just thunderingly loud. And it's like, it's an opera. Yeah. He definitely studied it.
Well, that is the other thing I really like about the Lord of the Rings scores is the choirs.
Yes. I love, one of my favorite film scores is one called Cutthroat Island by John Debney. Okay. Absolutely terrible film, but it's with the London Symphony Orchestra and the London Voices. And it's just, you get that entanglement of the choir with the orchestra just playing this big, loud pirate score. And it's like, I will say it puts Pirates of the Caribbean to shame.
Oh yeah.
Like it is so good. It is so good. But you're right, the choir, and then it's like his interpretation of Tolkien's languages.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, and that's the thing, all the choirs, I don't think any of it's English. I think all of it is based in Elvish or other, Tolkien created tongues. Which is really cool. I've never taken the time to actually like transcribe what they're singing or look up what they're singing. But it's really cool that he did that. Like the amount of work that must have gone into scoring those, and even just preparing to score them, is crazy to me.
That's why it's like he was nominated for Oscars the same years as like John Williams and Danny Elfman, and it's like, but it's like he deserved everything he won, because it's like, just like you said, for all the work and effort he put into it. Even if he had help, it's like he had to possibly invent parts of the language that Tolkien never thought of. So,
now a question I do have for you, I know a little bit. I don't know if maybe you know more or not, but so when it comes to scoring a film, I would assume that process takes place quite a bit later, once they're like pretty far into the post phase, where they're, the film's mostly been edited and they have some sort of rough cut before you even get to the composer to, start putting together themes based on, the visuals.
The vast majority of the time, yes. Because what you do is you wait for something to be what's called picture locked.
Okay.
And usually the composer is signed on like when the film's done shooting, and they can kind of see some clips. They've read the script. They've started thinking about ideas, so that when the film is picture locked, that means the editing's done. The visuals are there, everything. You might not have visual effects, but the composer can start to time everything to the actions on screen.
Yeah, but picture locked basically meaning like the shots and the frames are complete.
They're all done. Yeah. The editor's not going to go back in and touch them up. If they do, that's like an 11th hour thing, and that's very dangerous to do because you just threw the whole movie off.
Right.
There have been some instances, usually with horror films, where I think it was like Suspiria, is the original Suspiria, is an example. They had the composer Goblin make the film score before the movie had filmed, and they played the music on set to get the people in the mood. Another example
that's kind of neat. I mean, obviously it would have to kind of be rescored, and everything would kind of have to be moved around depending on the final cut. But having that, but being able to hear that as an actor and knowing the tone or the mood that the director wants to set and listening to it, that's pretty cool.
There have been other ones. I think the Once Upon a Time series, like Once Upon a Time in the West, and the Clint Eastwood, Sergio Leone movies, and Ennio Morricone, who's another famous film composer. he also like the whistling cowboy theme or whatever.
Okay.
They had that playing on set too for the actors.
Yeah.
And then you get the other example, which John Williams, with E.T. So the ending of E.T., I think John Williams was having trouble scoring the way the film was being cut. And he was having all this trouble. So Spielberg actually told John Williams, because he had like this, what he wanted, he was like, conduct it like you would just a symphony. Go with your gut, conduct it, and then we'll cut the picture to the music.
Okay, yeah. So that's a totally different, or it's typically different than what they would normally do.
Exactly, and
I didn't know that.
At least in that case, it worked stunningly.
Oh yeah, that's like most of John Williams' soundtracks or film, not soundtracks, but film scores are right. Quite famous. I mean, I have the Indiana Jones theme song. Literally plays in my head every day and has for like 20 years. I couldn't tell you why.
Right. I looked it up once. It's like, because he repeats notes and it's almost like a kind of like an up and down kind of thing. And I mean, you want to talk about...
He does a lot of arpeggiation.
See, that's a word I don't know.
So an arpeggio is when you have a chord, bum, bum, bum. And instead of, if you play all three at once, you have a chord with harmony, but you can go bum, 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 bum. When you play the notes individually in sequence, that's arpeggiating.
Yep. He does that exactly. And it gets stuck in your head because of the repetition. We just wanted to take a moment to talk to you about this month's book of the month. For this month, we'll be reading The History of Love by Nicole Krauss, a 2005 novel, which was the finalist for the Orange Prize for Fiction and won the 2008 William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. The novel tells the tale of an older gentleman who wrote a novel based on his youth, and a young girl who is named after the protagonist in that novel, and the intersection of their lives. We hope you'll join us in taking this month to read this book, and join us at the end of the month to discuss it, just like we have with all the other books of the month. We'll keep you posted on our progress, and we hope to see you at the end of the month when we discuss it. Now, back to the episode. And I mean, you want to talk about a film series whose music is probably just as complex as Lord of the Rings, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Though it's interesting, whenever I think of Star Wars, like... I mean, obviously, a lot of people think of the music. You have the Imperial March and you have the Cantina Band and stuff like that. But I feel like when I think of the film scores for Star Wars, I think of specific songs. I've never really considered them as a whole, thematically, I guess.
Yep, but it's like you could see how Howard Shore and John Williams and others like them are different, but it's like it's that same kind of tapestry of telling the story, and especially like the emotional anchor, I guess you could say, of the story and of the characters. Because oftentimes what directors will reference and what composers reference when they're talking about scoring a film is the music is the anchor for the audience. Like you could have this completely strange idea on screen, but then the music is telling you exactly what to feel. You should be afraid. You should be in awe. You should be this. You should be that.
Yeah, we talked about that in a previous episode, music kind of being the universal language where even if you're watching a film in a different language without subtitles and you might not know what's going on, even just from actors' facial expressions or movements, the music will tell you how you're supposed to feel about it.
Right. And it's cross-cultural too, one thing I just want to mention is like another one of my favorite film scores is from a guy named Klaus Badelt, who is
he did Pirates. He's the one who did Pirates.
He did the first Pirates score, and he's like a student or a follower of like not James Horner, Hans Zimmer's like train of thought, the heavy electronic, heavy bass. He made a film score for a movie called The Promise, or Wu Ji, which was a Chinese film. It was the most expensive one at the time. And it was performed by the China National Symphony Orchestra. And what it is, you get these Western sensibilities, like the big symphonic sound, like Wagner, Beethoven, performed by a Chinese orchestra using specialty instruments, but also violin, trumpet. So it's this interesting melding of sound.
Western instruments with more traditionally cultural Chinese instruments and timbres.
But also composed in like this grand European way. Because I think Klaus Badelt is German.
It sounds very German.
Yeah, so it's like you're getting that mix of sensibilities, and it works so well.
Yeah. Well, see, when I think of Klaus Badelt with Pirates of the Caribbean, I mean, you said he kind of followed Hans Zimmer with a lot of electronic influence stuff, but that's not what the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack is. When I think of it, I think of drums, I think of bells, I think of moods. Yeah, that was the first film soundtrack, sorry, I keep saying that and it's incorrect. The first film score that I owned on CD. I grew up with Lion King and Oliver and Company and soundtracks, and I loved Elton John's original versions of some of the Lion King songs. But Pirates of the Caribbean was the one, and actually me and a lot of my friends in high school, like, we used to listen to that album a lot, surprisingly, considering we were also listening to Linkin Park and just modern rock bands. But surprisingly, like, yeah, me and all my friends, like that album kind of like went around. Everyone was real into it because it's very driving. It's fun.
Yeah. See, for me, it was because when I was first getting into it, it was unpopular to listen to anything but like rock and whatever.
I grew up the idea of having like contemporary Christian music, so I wasn't listening to popular stuff.
That's very yeah. I was in public schools in Connecticut. But I remember, like, also you just made me think of like Danny Elfman with the Spider-Man soundtrack, like how you mentioned soundtrack versus score.
Yes.
Which for all of our listeners, the big difference is a score is composed specifically for the film, and it's pretty much just the orchestral music, the accompaniment, whereas a soundtrack is a collection of songs that might not have been specifically made for the movie. So when you see like a compilation, that's when it's a soundtrack.
Or what would you call, say, like Lion King or like a lot of Disney's that have, they have songs built into the movies, and so sometimes you get a collection of just the songs in the movies, like Let It Go from Frozen, for example. And then sometimes because a lot of like Disney films, you can get the soundtrack and the film score. Like they're two separate things. One of them is the songs from the film, and then one of them is all of the music going on in the scenes.
I would say like soundtrack in that case, because soundtrack is also like the overarching umbrella term. So like Lion King, you have the songs by Elton John, and then the score, but I think Hans Zimmer, which was one of the few Disney scores.
That was Hans Zimmer also.
That was his first Oscar, was Lion King.
I didn't know that. I always associate Elton John with him, as I assume most people do.
No,
I didn't know that.
I mean, the two of them worked very closely together, if I remember right. But it's like it was just so interesting because Alan Menken was the Disney voice, and then they got Hans Zimmer, and it's like, oh, won an Oscar. But I would say soundtrack is like the old umbrella term. So when you get songs and score, that's soundtrack, and then when you get just the instrumentals, it's score.
Okay.
But what was it, like the first big soundtrack I remember, and this was around the same time as Lord of the Rings too, was Spider-Man. Danny Elfman.
Yeah, I love Danny Elfman, but that one I don't know. I don't know a lot of Danny Elfman stuff like specifically, but when I listen to Danny Elfman, like it's always good, and it always sounds like Danny Elfman.
Yep, like one of my favorite movie scores is Edward Scissorhands, again because of the choir. It's just so beautiful to listen to. But no, like the Spider-Man, because it had like a dedicated main title sequence with like all the animation with the webs, and it's like it had Danny Elfman's music in it. And that was one of the first times where it's like the music like hammered you over the head.
Yeah,
I would say, because there was a whole sequence dedicated to it.
That's cool.
But yeah, no, that was influential, I would say.
So if we want to talk, especially we're talking Howard Shore, we're talking John Williams, we're talking a lot of these composers, and the films that we're discussing specifically are trilogies or series. Howard Shore worked on all of the Lord of the Rings and all the Hobbit movies. now if we look at Harry Potter, John Williams worked on the first 3, and you can see Sorcerer's Stone and Chamber of Secrets, I think, are very, very similar.
Yes.
Prisoner of Azkaban, which John Williams also did, definitely took a different turn, but I think a lot of that probably had to do with Alfonso Cuarón, because he took the series in a very different direction. Again, we mentioned this before, a lot of directors like to put their mark. Chris Columbus wanted to stay very true to the books. Mind you, I mean, he was working with shorter books with much less complex plots and much, fewer subplots. He was also having to work with young children, so it had to be fanciful, and he was going for traditional, I think. But when we get to Alfonso Cuarón, the color palettes changed. A lot more humor was introduced.
They're wearing normal clothes instead of robes.
They're wearing normal clothes. He adds in it's more quirky. It was a different type of wizarding world, and I think John Williams' film score for that is it definitely reflects the visuals.
Very much so. Because I mean, the other thing because I love Prisoner of Azkaban as a film, because again,
yes, I do too.
I love Alfonso Cuarón as a film director. All of his films are great, but I love like the swooping camera and how everything is constantly moving and active.
Yep. Just watch all the camera shots for like the night bus scene. And the music with the night bus. It's just, it's so much fun.
Right. And it's like, again, because like how I mentioned earlier with the first Harry Potter score, there were like 2 notable themes. And that was something I noticed at my young age. It's like, it's very repetitious. And then the Chamber of Secrets, like you started to see Chris Columbus experiment.
A little bit,
film.
sure. Like it's still the longest Harry Potter film. Yep, it was like 2 hours and 48 minutes or something, and it's the worst book, which is not saying much. It's a great book, but as a series as a whole, like it's
the weakest
not my
one.
favorite. Yeah,
right. But you're right. Then you got Alfonso Cuarón doing this interesting thing, and then you got John Williams reacting to it and saying, "Okay, this score is going to be much more dynamic." But I remember
it was
still
just more
thinking,
playful. Like, I think it was bouncier, it's playful, it was more upbeat.
But at this point, it's like, yes, you had like the repeating themes, like da 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 da, like you got all that, but you still didn't have a real central identity. Like there was one thing I read, which is a really good point. Harry doesn't have a theme in the movie.
Not technically, no. It's Hedwig's theme.
No, he doesn't.
But I'm saying, but Hedwig's theme is often used. Well, no, I guess it's not really used for Harry. It's in Prisoner of Azkaban. John Williams uses Hedwig's theme during the transition during the seasons.
Right.
Whenever the season changes, they show a shot of the Whomping Willow, and if it's fall, it shakes all of its leaves off and things like that. And that's when Hedwig's theme is being played, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's exactly it. And then like Harry's Wondrous World, which is more about the wizarding world, not Harry himself. The only 2 times that it comes close to being his theme is, in my opinion, in Prisoner of Azkaban. There's a song called A Window to the Past, which is like this recorder song played on the recorder.
Okay.
And it has more to do with Harry thinking about his parents. But it's such a sad theme. And then in the 4th Harry Potter film, which is one of my favorite scores for the series by Patrick Doyle, there Harry in Winter, I believe is the name of it. And that's the closest anyone gets to giving Harry his own theme.
Oh yeah. Oh, see, I had never really thought about that.
Yeah, it's something I didn't think about.
I do know, like, was it Alexandre Desplat that did the final 2 or 3 films?
The last 2.
He did the last 2. Like the only person who got a theme in those movies was Lily. And she's not even, and she's a character who's dead for the entire series. But it is a gorgeous theme, but it's so vastly different from the themes that John Williams introduced to us at the beginning of the series. It's much more sorrowful. And I noticed like Alexandre Desplat's film score it's not minimalist, but it's much more restrained than all of the previous scores.
He's a very intellectual composer. Like you look at his music for even simple stories like The Girl with the Pearl Earring, my favorite painting, or what was it? It was the Golden Compass. They're very
the original film, or
the original one. Yep.
Yeah.
In the early 2000s or the mid 2000s. And they're very intellectual. They're very smart. But at the same time, what that does is it starts to hold you back because it's very cold and distant because it's so much is going on.
Yeah. I also have a huge issue, and this is kind of it's a personal thing, though I think people will agree with me to some extent that like the dialogue mixing in the Harry Potter series as a whole in all of them is terrible. If you're like, a lot of the times if you're not familiar with the plot and the characters, like there are some very important lines that are spoken in those films where the actors' faces are turned away and the dialogue is mixed so low that you can barely tell what they're saying without subtitles.
Yep.
And I remember coming out of Prisoner of Azkaban and my mom being like, yeah, I have no idea what was happening. She was like, I couldn't understand any of the dialogue, which is so unfortunate because like the music for those films is so well mixed, but the dialogue is just like, it's not loud enough. It's like, it's too dynamic for a film. Like, yes, you want it to be loud and you want it to be soft, but when it's such a wide range, and when so much of it is spoken softly with actors' faces turned away from you where you can't even see their lips moving, yeah, that's tough.
Mm-hmm. See, that's part of, at least in terms of recording sound for film, using the different microphones to your best advantage. Like, because Alfonso Cuarón likes big moving cameras. The problem with that is like the boom mics. You always have to be moving them to keep them out of shot.
Yep.
Like I remember in junior high, we saw the first trailer for that movie.
I had never thought about that. That's a light bulb moment for me, and it seems so obvious, especially as someone who's like sold pro audio gear for a living for a while.
And I think like lapel mics they're not big because you could hear
I don't imagine they ever use lapel mics on film shoots.
Yeah, because you hear the rustle.
Right.
But I remember, this is actually a little fun fact. In junior high, when the first trailer for Prisoner of Azkaban was released, the librarian, she had noticed something and she was showing the trailer to us in a class. And then she said, and pause. And there's a shot in the film when Harry and Hermione go back in time with the time turner. And they're outside Hagrid's hut and they're hiding behind one of the big pumpkins. And the camera like pushes in and Hermione spins around to look.
Yes, I know I know what you're talking about.
In the original shot, you could see the boom mic in the trailer. Yeah. You could see the boom mic at the
just
top
in
of
the
trailer move out.
Ooh, I'm gonna have to go
airbrushed
check that
out. But the teacher was like, and pause, and she just pointed to the boom mic, and she said that will be gone in the final film, but it's there. And it's like, that's the problem with like a constantly moving camera, which I love. The sound people are like running around.
Oh yeah, and obviously you can tell that almost none of the lines, if any of the lines, were dubbed over in post. It was all dialogue from when they were, which
could be
shooting.
Part of the mixing problem too, because when you're shooting on location, you get all of the problems of mixing. Like
but you can still use compression and gain a little better than they did, I think. I mean, I'm not being paid to do that, and I don't do that professionally. But like,
you also have to remember this was 2003, so I'm not sure how far the technology has come since then. But
microphones haven't changed in that regards. Microphones still work the same that they did 50 years ago. They've just their frequency response has gotten a little bit better.
Gotcha. Okay, I just have to ask you one other question. What's your opinion on Christopher Nolan's sound?
So, I don't know if I necessarily have one because it's not something I've thought about a whole lot. I mean, I know I remember listening to the Inception soundtrack when it came out because I've had friends like you who are big into film scores and soundtracks.
Right.
And I remember listening to the Inception one and getting just a couple like tracks in and just thinking, I don't want to listen to this without the film. Yeah. Not because it was bad, but it's just, and I also was much younger in my musical journey at that point. I was still kind of closed-minded about the music I was listening to, less open to new genres, new sounds. So So that's something I should do is like go back and listen to it. But there's like no melody. It's not harmony. It's all sound design. It's
Yep.
it's sounds, it's fields, it's moods. Very
Which
synthesizer heavy.
Right. Which, I've expressed this to you before. I'm pretty sure I've said in a previous episode, like my opinion on Hans Zimmer, who composed a lot of the music for Christopher Nolan's films. From, I believe he collaborated with James Newton Howard on Batman Begins, and then all the way up to Dunkirk. And now he quit. He stepped out of Tenet so that he could do Dune. But one of the biggest things with Hans Zimmer I've noticed is he's transitioned in his style to be slightly more sound design and more ambient.
Slightly more. I feel like
I know.
it's much more. But mind you, I'm not familiar with like his early works, so I don't know what I'm. But for my comparisons, it's very much firmly rooted in sound design.
It is, because he's always experimental, and like to me, there's three sides to him. There's when I say small, they're not necessarily small, but like there's music from Beyond Rangoon and The Creator and even Wonder Woman 1984 to an extent, that are very traditional, but they're in his style, very heavy, very pounding, the drums and very driving beats, but it's like they're very hummable melodies.
Okay.
And especially Beyond Rangoon.
So some of his earlier stuff was still melodic and thematic.
Yep, it used a lot of electronics, but that's not a bad thing. No, like Jerry Goldsmith.
It's just a different timbre, style. Different sound and feel, but it can still be very, very melodic.
Exactly. And then you get his synth heavy side, like the movie Crimson Tide, and some of it's what's called remote control.
Sorry. Thanks, Riverside.
Is it going to do it again? No. Okay. Oh, there it is.
It embeds it in the video, like.
Oh, I should do that.
Yeah, it gets embedded in the video. Like, I can't take it out. I don't know why they do it. It's so stupid. But anyways.
It is really. Anyway, Riverside, everyone. But then he also, in the 90s, he was part of what was called Remote Control, which is it was like a band of composers. Klaus Badelt was among them, who kind of like, they were tutored by him, or they learned style through him. And very, very repetitive, easy to digest electronic scores. Like, listen to Crimson Tide, then listen to The Rock, Armageddon, Twister. They all kind of start to sound like they're the same. Like, you could just mesh them together and you could throw them out. And then you get his more modern, I would say, sound design side, like his Christopher Nolan movies and the Dark Knight movies, Dune, which, like you said, you put the nail on the head. You need to watch the movie to fully enjoy them. Yeah. Because outside of like that one song from Inception, the like dun dun, it's all just ambience.
Yeah.
That's what I would consider like Hans Zimmer, because he's probably, I would say, like one of the more popular composers. Like, everyone would know his name outside of like John Williams, But
Are there any other like niche film scores or composers that maybe aren't as well known that you would recommend people check out? Because a lot of us, probably who are listening to this, we're familiar with all the ones we've talked about. They're big name composers and films that have all won awards. But what are some of the more niche ones that you like that maybe aren't quite as popular or as well known?
Well, so I usually go with like my top 3 film scores that I could always listen to. Cutthroat Island by John Debney.
Okay. What is it about it that you like?
It's fun. It's loud. It's got that lovely combination of choir and orchestra. The London Symphony Orchestra, which is legendary for John Williams.
Yes, I've been to the London Symphony. I've seen them multiple times. Just
and it's just a fun score. Yeah, big, bold. So that there's also what is it? I'm looking at iTunes on the side to see what other scores. Another one of my top 3 is Edward Scissorhands by Danny Elfman. Again, just beautiful. Just the choir just singing quietly, and it's just a beautiful. That's one of the movies where it's like, there's really just one theme, but it's handled so expertly. Yeah. And then there's a TV miniseries called Children of Dune, And the composer,
based on the
it's the
Frank
only
Herbert book.
Yep. Let me just look up who the composer was, because I forget. Brian Tyler, and
I haven't even heard of him.
It's this great score, television. It's one of the few Dune scores, even above Hans Zimmer's for the newer movie so far, that balance epicness with the cultural side.
Yeah.
So it gives both equal measure, and it's just the melodies are just so awesome to listen to, especially like the worm riding scenes. It's just so good. Cool. Other ones that I would suggest, there's Perfume, the story of a murderer.
Oh,
the film score for that movie.
I didn't even know there was a film for that. I read that like 2 or 3 years ago. You know whose favorite book that was?
You've mentioned, I think, but whose?
Kurt Cobain.
I was going to say Kurt Cobain.
I found out about that book because I was watching an interview. It's one of, if not the last known interview that Kurt Cobain ever did before he died. And it was done like on a pier, and it wasn't like a big well-known journalist or news media outlet. It was someone more independent who was literally just chatting with him and wasn't asking him questions about the band and Nirvana and touring and your lyrics and all of this. She asked him a question like, what's your favorite book? And he said like, oh, it's so refreshing to have an interview
something
like
different.
And so he talked about Perfume and said he had that book with him everywhere he went. And whenever he got bored, he would just pick it up and read it. He said it's like the only book he ever read, and he read it over and over and over again. So I ended up picking it up and reading it, and it's disturbing, but it's phenomenal. It's so good. Now I didn't know there was a film, so now I have to check it out. And apparently it has a good film score.
It does. The director of the film, Tom Tykwer, who also made a movie called Run, Lola, Run. It's a German film.
That one's not based on Lola, is it?
No.
Oh, I'm thinking Lolita. Another very disturbing book.
Yes.
Much more so.
I won't go into it here, but Run, Lola, Run is really good. It's a very unique film. But the director of the film actually composed the score too with two other gentlemen. I don't remember their names.
Oh, the director did, you said.
Yes. Which is it's an interesting thing when you hear it. And the fact that it's still a disturbing score because there's one song called Streets of Paris, which is basically the main character Grenouille's first experience in public. And it's beautiful, but then every once in a while there's like this metallic churning under the melody, which constantly reminds you, it's like, hey, this guy's a creep. He's not good.
Right.
So that's a film score I could recommend. A
good example of how the score can tell you things that's not being shown in the film. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's just like the example of Jaws, the classic example of the theme is for the shark. So when the theme's not playing, the shark's not there.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point we can make. Is how a lot of film people who score films, most well-known being John Williams, are in the classical music world known as thieves.
Yes.
Lots of very great film scores and film themes are taken from well-known classical works. There's the old saying that, good composers borrow, great composers steal. They do it properly, but the theme for Jaws is the fourth movement of
the New World
Antonin
Symphony.
Dvorak's New World Symphony, the fourth movement. Ba-dum, ba-dum,
Ba-dum.
ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da, 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 ba-da. Like it's taken directly from it, and then he takes that theme and makes it his own. But like it's not even a different key. He doesn't change the rhythm. It's exactly the same.
Exactly.
And it came from one of the most well-known symphonies of the Romantic period, and it is one of the most well-known film score themes in cinema history.
Yep. I watched a video where they compared the two, just like you said, and they're exactly the same.
They're exactly the same. That's the thing. Like he didn't borrow it. Like he took it. He took that theme, which is the opening for that movement, and placed it at the beginning of the film, and then and then use that to help build on the rest of it.
Well, even Star Wars, originally George Lucas wanted to score the film using Gustav's Holst, the planets, like the whole symphony just spread out.
That.
And you could still, I mean, it would have been awesome because I love.
Would have been awesome.
Yes,
the planets is so like good. Well, go ahead and tell yours, and then I'll give my little story.
What I was going to say was the ending. You could still see it in one scene because John Williams definitely used that for inspiration.
Yeah.
The scene where after they fire onto the Death Star and all the ships are flying away, it's like that music that's just going dun 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 dun. That's the ending of
that's Mars.
Mars, yeah. It's that uneven kind of like beat. And it's like it's straight up just carried over to the film score.
Yeah. No, I love Holst Planet Suite. We when I was in high school, our marching band one year we did Gustav Holst. So like we marched to Jupiter, and I got to see the Planet Suite performed live by the National Symphony Orchestra down in Virginia at the Wolf Trap Amphitheater, and they were doing it in conjunction with the Mars rover landing, and the images that the Mars rover had captured, and they were revealing those images to the public for the first time on a giant projector behind the orchestra. So like my mom and I went, and we got to see these brand new close-up images of Mars for the first time with Holst's Planet Suite being played, and it was just absolutely epic. It was one of the coolest shows I've ever been to.
That's unbeatable.
Oh, it was so cool. It's such a cool way to be like, hey, we made it to another planet. Like, check out these pics.
Yeah, which is funny because when the planets first came out, I don't think it was received especially well because people didn't know how to react to it.
I don't know. I think it was received pretty well.
I think because I remember reading on Wikipedia like audiences liked it, and like there's an account of Jupiter during like the waltz scene of like a janitor out in the hallway like dancing to it.
Yeah,
like because the music. And I mean, like the one thing I think of now when I think of it, have you heard of a show called Bluey?
No.
It's an Australian children's show about it's animated about the little blue dog with his family. And there's one episode that uses Jupiter.
Yeah.
It's called Bedtime. And like the kids can't fall to sleep. And it's just like this beautiful use of Jupiter. And I remember when I first heard it, I was like, the planets. So, but no, like I think like the big people in the music industry at the time, like the early 1900s, didn't like it. They said it was too avant-garde. It was too different, like using a choir and stuff. It was too, but then audiences loved it. This is what I've read.
Maybe,
so I
maybe
don't
it's
know.
what you've read. Yeah, I don't know if I buy that, but I mean, you never know. Because I mean, I guess I'm familiar with more like other stuff, like Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique came out, and it was actually in like the 1830s, and there's directions in there for the violin players to turn their bow around and use the wooden part of it on their strings for real fun. Screechy noises. You know, that's in the symphony. It was revolutionary. People didn't like that. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring with the really high-pitched like bassoon intro and these weird heavy ostinato rhythms and lots of uses of tritones. A lot of people were like, what the hell is this? You know, yeah, the garage door's going up.
Was that yours or mine?
No, it's mine. I was just talking through it.
Okay.
And like Shostakovich, Dmitri Shostakovich, famous 20th century Russian composer, who was writing a lot of music kind of against the Russian state and against the people in power. But in order to keep from being sent to a gulag, he still had to make it sound powerful and Russian, because he needed to appease the leaders of Russia. But he still wanted to have his integrity as a musician.
Right.
And the only reason I bring any of this up is because I don't recall anything like that happening with Planet's Holst Suite, and I have a decent grasp on a lot of classic music history.
I was going to say, you're much more familiar with classical.
Yeah. I mean, it's very possible that it is as you read it. I have never heard that. I feel like his Planet Suite has kind of always been just admired.
I mean, especially now, it's like it's the one of the biggest symphonies, like up there with Beethoven. You know,
just in terms of being well-known melodies. Yeah,
well-known, yes. But that's actually one question I would have for you, because you know your classical music, because classical music is typically considered like the intellectuals. Music,
oftentimes, I mean,
yes,
kind of cliche, sort of, but yes,
right. It is cliche,
it's
you know, world of cliches.
For hundreds of years, it was seen as, you know, it was the music of the aristocracy, and you know, if you have money, you know, you sent your kids to conservatory to study music. It was very highbrow. And I think a lot of that has still carried on into today, but not to the same extent that it had been for centuries.
Would you consider film scores just as relevant as classical music, like in almost like the same ballpark, if that makes sense? Is it simpler, more complex?
In what sense, though?
Well, because like how we talked about leitmotif. I don't even know if this will make sense, but like leitmotif and the complexity of the scores and stuff. Would you consider it just as intellectual, just as important, just as relevant to listen to it for like music study as you would classical?
Sure. And I mean, honestly, I mean, I would put film scores as a subgenre of classical music. It's just, it's a form of classical music that is designed to be listened to with a visual medium at the same time.
Is modern opera, if you wanted to say.
In a way, yeah. The only reason I say in a way is because there is still modern opera that's very good. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of the main difference. And it also, I mean, a lot of it, I'd say it depends on the score, but then again, like modern classical music is very, very different from what even early and mid 20th century classical music was. A lot of them are incorporating synthesizers. A lot of them are incorporating like Foley type sounds. And it's not just your traditional band or orchestra that classical music is being recorded with nowadays. There's, you know, a lot of them are experimenting with lots of different sounds. I mean, when I was in college, we were playing pieces by a modern composer named Frank Ticheli, who I've met. Really, really wonderful man. And he has songs, you know, we had like speakers that were attached, and he has entire parts written with the software Ableton. You know, he has sounds that you basically import into Ableton, and you have to, you know, cue them up to play at proper times. They have, you know, big, long, like swimming noodles. You know what I'm talking about? The foam noodles that you cut at certain lengths and whirl them around for certain pitches. You know, like we played these things when I was in college. So film scores, you know, they might not be going to that lengths, but just the idea that modern classical music and film scores are not all that different. It's just that film scores are designed to support
a story.
They're designed to support a visual medium, not necessarily just tell a story on their own, though I think a good film score does tell that story on its own without the film.
Right.
If that makes
serves
sense.
As inspiration, or just like even it definitely does, because that's just something I've always thought of in my head, because some people might think like, oh, well, you know, film scores, they're just they're in service to a story. They can't stand on their own. The only reason they exist is because of this medium. And you could say that about a lot of things, like how I made the opera comparison.
I'm going to say it again yesterday. What's the C word? Context.
Content.
Come on, John. We're 10, 11 episodes in at this point.
I mean, this is an improvement on the C word I thought it was yesterday. So
yeah, I don't use that C word.
I try not to, but it sometimes comes out.
But yeah, no, it's all context. You know, it's not just whether it's good or not. It's what are you comparing it to? What is it in reference of? What are you trying to learn about it? What are you trying to feel from it? You know, it all depends on so many different factors, like everything does. So I think it depends on the lens you're looking at it through.
Yes, very much so. I would agree.
Hey there. If you're enjoying Storyweavers and want to get to know us better, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/StoryweaversPodcast. You can support us further by becoming a bookworm, screenwriter, or publisher supporter and enjoy exclusive perks such as access to the live recordings of Storyweavers, Q&A sessions, early access to episodes, voting on Book of the Month polls, and more. Our goal is to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted. Huge thanks to everyone who's been listening to Storyweavers. Now back to the episode.
You know, like, I'm really glad you brought up the thing about John Williams with the New World Symphony, because it's like that, the moment I heard, and it also begs the question, like how you were saying, borrowing and stealing. It's like some people have gone after John Williams. It's like he's nothing but he's stealing from others, and it's like they all steal from each other.
They all do.
It's and what you said, he takes it into an like, you don't think of New World Symphony and then, oh, Shark. But
yeah, no, he didn't take New World Symphony and just put it into the movie. I mean, copyright law for music, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this, is I believe you can't use more than what is considered 10% of the song, which is a very gray area, because what is 10% of a song? Is that if it's a 3-minute song, is that, 30 seconds of it? That's not right. 20 seconds of it. Is it, you can, if there's 4 instruments, you can only use part of one instrument. I mean, I don't know what the law looks like, but general idea is less than 10%. He's taken the opening theme. Now that theme is used throughout that entire movement. It comes back at the end. So I don't know how you define 10%, but that's all he did. He took ba-dum, 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 ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He took that and then ran with it. So, like, you could call it stealing. Technically, under copyright law, it's okay. He got away with quote, got away with it. But that happens all the time. You talk to any modern songwriter, or it doesn't even have to be modern. You go talk to Led Zeppelin or the Beatles. All of them, there were melodies or drum rhythms or chord progressions of songs they liked, and they took those and then made them their own.
Right.
And then you have examples of say, for example, Coldplay's Viva La Vida. I know we're getting into kind of a different topic here at this point.
Go ahead.
Coldplay's Viva La Vida is, and I think they lost this lawsuit to Joe Satriani. He has a song called, I want to say it's called Learning to Fly, but that could be wrong. But the melody and chord progression and rhythm is like taken straight from a Joe Satriani solo. Bum 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 bum. But so like that ostinato part, that's going on, and then Chris Martin's vocal melody in Viva La Vida is the exact same melody as Joe Satriani's solo, going over that chord progression ostinato.
Yep.
So, and I'm pretty sure they lost that lawsuit, but but then again, that also begs, did they know that that's where they took it from? Or is it a song that had been, something that had been stuck in their head that they put down that happened to come from it? I don't want to get into that debate. I don't know. But my point being, like, when you're talking about stealing versus borrowing, I mean, it's very common in classic music. Cause I remember I had, there's kind of like 2 different thoughts on it. I had a high school band teacher who said, there are only so many notes and so many melodies that you can make in Western music. You've got 12 tones, you've got 12 keys, you have, 8th note, quarter note, 16th note, and you can rearrange them a whole bunch of different ways, but eventually things are going to come out the same at some point. But then I also had a very good friend of mine, Peter, who argued with me on that point and said, well, yeah, but there's only 26 letters in the English language, and yet people are still writing books with new ideas and new stories. And so, but the idea is that like, yes, it's always going to be derivative of something
else. Exactly. Like how we talked about the sound design with Hans Zimmer. It's like, think of the Joker's theme from The Dark Knight. It's a single note that just slowly rises up. It begs the question, is that music? Like, some people would say yes, because it was performed on musical instruments.
We had an interesting discussion in one of my freshman classes in college. Our professor would come in and every Monday morning, what he would do was he would play us a random piece of music. It could be Gregorian chants. It could be an 18th century opera. It could be a 20th century. He showed us one time. It was a famous piece of I'm going to say music in quotes here because that's what's being argued is whether this was music. Mm-hmm. And there was a very long discussion in our class between people who had very opposing opinions on it. What he played for us was a guy, I believe he was Japanese, threw a whole bunch of violins, cellos, and everything into a bonfire and lit it on fire and recorded it. And the argument was, is this music? Because the definition of music is basically a collection of sounds that are put purposely together for the purpose of listening. Mm-hmm. And so he purposely took these instruments and put them in a fire and lit them on fire and recorded it. And it doesn't have, nothing says music has to have harmony. Nothing says music has to have melody. Nothing says music has to have rhythm. Mm-hmm. So yes, these sound design soundtracks, some people might not consider them music in the traditional sense, but they're still evoking the same type of emotion and response that music does. It just might be a lot more negative to some people.
Fire. And then you hear like the snapping of strings and everything. And without context, it's...
Right. It might not sound like anything.
Like how you said. Mm-hmm. Context.
So is there anything else you wanted to bring up, or should we wrap this one up? We're over an hour at this point.
Yes, we've got on for a while, and I think that's pretty much all the bases.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to Storyweavers this week, and it was great getting to hear more about. It's something that John is very passionate about, is film scores. So it was fun for me to listen to him talk about it, and I now have a list of film scores and movies that I need to see to my ever-growing list that will never finish.
And it never will. Like, but
I'll at least get around to Cutthroat Island and definitely Perfume, just because I'm familiar with that one as well. Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing all of your insights. I enjoyed that very much.
Thank you for letting me ramble. It was great.
All right, we'll see you guys next week. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yes, enjoy. See you soon.
Yay.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Storyweavers. As ever, we're incredibly grateful to all of our listeners and contributors. Come back next week for the next installment of Storyweavers.